This lecture is on the Enlightenment. While the outlook of the vast majority of Europeans remained decidedly medieval, the most adventurous minds of the 17th century, the 1600s, developed notions about humanity that rested on the Renaissance views, but pressed beyond them. The conceptions fall conveniently into three categories. First, individualism, then relativism, and then a rationalism tempered with empiricism or knowledge derived from the senses. Radical thinkers of the 17th century, the 1600s, took an increasingly individualistic look of man. Radical thinkers of the 17th century, the 1600s, took an increasingly individualistic view of man in society. The fashion was to start with the individual and then to seek explanations and justifications for the existence of societies and states. Supporters of the divine theory of kingship remained numerous, but by mid-century, or about 1650, the notion of an explicit or implicit contract between people and ruler was widespread. The idea of a social contract soon took its place by the side of that of a political contract. Society, according to the social contract theorists, was itself the result of a voluntary agreement among individuals who had been absolutely independent in their original state of nature. The two ideas, somewhat confusedly, began to merge and walk together, and later political philosophers. The two ideas next to each other, somewhat confusedly, walked in both contracts. The individual with his rights and his natural independence logically came first, then came society or the state. The greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages were confident that the peoples of Christendom were God's chosen people, and that the divine revelation of the Bible gave humanity all necessary truths. That self-assurance evaporated during the 16th and 17th centuries thanks to humanism, the ages of discovery. That self-assurance evaporated during the 16th and 17th centuries thanks to humanism, to the voyages of discovery, and to the development of science. Humanism had begun to reveal the Greco-Roman civilization in its historical perspective. The Renaissance had first created the modern disciplines of history, archaeology, and philology, but the 17th century scholars broadened and deepened these disciplines, and soon thinkers began to realize that the origin of historical relativism, of the notion that value systems, including those of Christian Europe, were historical phenomena subject to change. This meant that there were no undeniable truths that people could rely on, whether these truths be the Bible or originated in the church hierarchy. The Age of Discovery added to historical relativism a geographical concept and counterpart. The discovery in Asia and America and in others of the discovery in America and Asia and other society the discovery in America and Asia of other societies shattered European provincialism. The tribal hunter-gatherers of America and Africa the urban civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas, and the great empires of Asia with their advanced arts and amenities inspired study and reflection. And soon people began to wonder if perhaps the pagans or noble savages of the New World were happier than the more cultured but corrupted Christians of Europe. One of the most important authors in this period was the skeptic Pierre Bayle. He was born a Huguenot, briefly converted to Catholicism, and then renounced all Orthodox belief when his brother died in a French dungeon during an attempt at forced conversion. He resided and did his writing in the relatively tolerant Dutch Netherlands by devoting the latter part of his life to a crusade against suspicion, religious intolerance, and dogma of all kinds. In 1697, Bayle published a huge volume, The Historical and Critical Dictionary. Into this tome, he poured a relativism and skepticism acquired through extensive historical study, an amateur knowledge of science, and his experience. He defied convention by insisting that religion and political stability were not inseparable, that atheists could be good citizens, he asserted. He denounced religious conversions by force. He ridiculed astrology, a form of superstition even more current than now. He denounced religious conversions by force. He ridiculed astrology, a form of superstition even more current then than now. He derided tales of miracles. He distrusted all historical authorities, including the writers of the Old Testament, unless that account of events was inherently credible. The leading thinkers of the 1600s began a process that reached completion only by the 1700s by replacing the lost certainties of religious belief with the new object of worship, reason. It was the faculty that in theory distinguished humanity from the animal world. It was trustworthy. The triumph of 17th century science had proved that. An increasingly optimistic age concluded that reason gave humanity the certain knowledge of the world that religion no longer appeared to offer. And reason provided a law. It was called natural law to replace the foundation of religious belief that now failed to provide for human knowledge. The idea was not new. Greek philosophers such as Aristotle had described a version of it. The Stoics had pressed it further, and Cicero had given the idea classic formulation when he said, "There is in fact a true law, namely right reason, which is in accordance with nature, applies to all men, and it is unchangeable and eternal. By commands this law summoned men to the performance of their duties. By its prohibitions it restrains them from doing wrong." St. Augustine had then Christianized the law by identifying it with the law of God. It was accepted by the medieval scholastics, and the discovery of scientific laws of nature, such as Kepler's laws of planetary motion, further reinforced the belief that natural law of human behavior must also exist. Success improving mathematical scientific laws inspired faith that reason could discern natural law in human affairs. The most influential example of that faith was John Locke's claim that every individual in the state of nature before the existence of organized societies possessed certain natural rights, most notably life, liberty, and property. From that followed that humanity had formed societies and set up governments mainly to preserve those rights. Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, 1690, which many readers hailed as the counterpart in his in the study of humanity to Newton's work on the forces of nature, the mind at birth was a tabula rasa of the mind. The mind at birth was a tabula rasa of the mind. The mind at birth was the tabula rasa of the mind to do good rather than evil. It did away equally with the revelation on which Christianity rested and with mathematical axioms. Above all, it undermined Locke's own conception of natural rights that were innate and not based on experience. The age known as the Enlightenment inherited this agonizing contradiction between the rationalist faith in natural law and the empiricists' break. The age known as the Enlightenment inherited this agonizing contradiction between the rationalist faith in natural law and the empiricist trust in sense experience and the evidence of comparative history. The task that the leading thinkers of the 18th century, the 1700s, set themselves was to popularize the methods and principles of the previous century's natural science discoveries and to apply these methods and principles to God, humanity, and society. While scientific discovery continued, the most brilliant writers of the age concentrated their efforts on applying the new scientific method to long-festering human ills, economic, social, political, and church or ecclesiastical ills. Their mission was less to discover new truth about nature than to apply the methods of natural science to the transformation of society. Break. The 1700s' own name for this movement was the Enlightenment, les Luminaires in French. The French break. The 1700s' own name for this movement was the Enlightenment, les Luminaires in French. The name suggested that the dawn of a new age of reason and knowledge after a long, dark night of ignorance, superstition, intolerance, and the despotism of kings and priests is at an end. As the great English poet Alexander Pope elegantly proclaimed, nature and nature's law lay hid in the night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Correspondence, the exchange of publications, and travel linked together a cultural movement that transcended state and religious boundaries. Enlightened writers and readers spent Enlightened writers and readers spanned Europe from Russia to Spain, from Edinburgh to Naples, from the Philadelphia of Benjamin Franklin to the Virginia of Thomas Jefferson. But the center of this Enlightenment movement was indisputably Paris. Break. 3 tendencies in French society united to make France the center of the Enlightenment. First, French government, after the death of Louis XIV in 1715, became steadily more inept and ineffectual, both internally and in its wars and diplomacy. confusion at home, and defeat abroad sapped the prestige of the existing order and of the church that upheld it. Secondly, the aristocracy began to take its revenge on the monarchy, Secondly, the aristocracy began to take its revenge on the monarchy that had reduced it to the role of court lapdog. That revenge consisted of the articulation and eager propagation of advanced and politically subversive ideas. Finally, the gradually increasing wealth that commerce and industry produced inspired in the growing urban middle classes that in increasingly consciousness, finally, the gradually increasing wealth that commerce and industry produced inspired in the growing urban middle classes that in increasingly consciousness, the greatly increasing wealth that commerce and industry produced inspired in the growing urban middle classes an increasingly high consciousness of their own worth and importance. The tension between the privileged and less privileged helped encourage an increasing body of literature that attacked the existing order of church and state at its weakest point. The close-mindedness of the church, the bureaucratic ineptitude of the nobility dominated by the royal administration, and the irresponsibility and arrogance of the nobility itself. The weapons of the French Enlightenment writers were clarity, wit, and a deliberate ambiguity designed to ward off the wrath of officialdom. Government censors were too often slow-witted and unable to catch hidden barbs aimed at church or state. And after the middle of the 1700s, they often secretly agreed with the critics. Censorship stopped only the most blatantly subversive and obviously blasphemous attacks on the existing order. And after the sixth break, censorship stopped only the most blatantly subversive or obviously blasphemous attacks on the existing order, and after the 1750s, it was almost powerless against the flood of social criticism and satire that poured from the presses. The source of that flood was Paris. There, the greatest intellectual figures of the age met and conversed in the salon for weekly gatherings that intellectual women of the aristocracy had begun to organize. The inhabitants of this world of ideas, whether commoner or noble, shared a common feeling that they were leading a revolution of ideas without precedent in European history, a crusade to end the absurdities and barbarity of the old order. The conventional date for the beginning of the Enlightenment as a movement was the visit to England from 1726 to 1729 by François-Marie Arouet, better known by his pen name, Voltaire. He lived from 1694 to 1778. The French government had twice imprisoned Voltaire in the Bastille fortress in Paris for alleged or actual witticisms made at the expense of royal or noble personalities. On the second occasion, he had achieved freedom by promising to leave for London. In England, he read Newton and Locke and relished the relative freedom of English society in comparison with his own. After returning to France, he published Philosophical Letters on the English, 1733, which passed on to his readers in non-mathematical form Newton's main principles and popularized Locke's theories of human nature and limited government. Voltaire's English letters set the tone of Enlightenment propaganda for the next half-century. They were philosophical in the broad sense, because they reflected on the facts of human existence, chose for very They were philosophical in a broad sense because they reflected on the facts of human existence and attempted to discover their meaning and their search for general principles useful to humanity as a whole. But the philosophers, as Voltaire and those of kindred spirit became known, had little use for metaphysics. They were less philosophizers. They were less philosophers than popularizers, crusaders for the application of the best intellectual tools of the century to social problems. Voltaire was the greatest of them all, the most prolific, the wittiest, the most readable, and perhaps the angriest. His preferred targets were bigotry, superstition, and despotism. Écrasez les infâmes. Break. Écrasez les femmes, cried Voltaire in his numerous letters, contracts, stories, and satires, to crush that infamous pain, the church. In the famous entry on religion in his Philosophical Dictionary, 1764, he described a vision he claimed to have had that described a desert filled with piles of bones of Christians with their throats slit by one another in metaphysical disputes. And he attacked the religious intolerance of contemporary France as vigorously as barbarism of the past. Notes break. Notice that the most superstitious age, he said, have always been those of the most horrible crimes. The superstitious man is ruled by fanatics and he becomes one himself. On the whole, the less superstition, the less fanaticism, he wrote. The superstitious man is ruled by fanatics and he becomes one himself. On the whole, the less superstition, the less fanaticism, the fewer miseries. When he died in 1778, Voltaire was the most widely read author in Europe, the first writer to have made a fortune from the sale of his own writings. Paris buried him with a ceremony worthy of a king. Break. The second leading French Enlightenment figure was Charles Louis de Secondant de Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755. Montesquieu attempted to create a social science by applying the methods of the natural sciences to the state of society. His The Spirit of Laws was not scientific by later standards, but it was the first serious attempt since the Greeks in tracing relationships between systems of government and the environment. Montesquieu, like Voltaire, found Locke's theory of limited government to be persuasive. As a French noble, he wished to limit the perceived excesses of royal absolutism. He followed Locke in concluding that the ideal political form involves the separation and balancing of powers within government. That conclusion later had great influence on the authors of the American Constitution. The third major figure of the French Enlightenment was Denis Diderot, 1713 through 1748. He was the co-editor of the The third major figure of the French Enlightenment was Denis Diderot, 1713 to 1748, co-editor of the famous Encyclopédie, an immense encyclopedia designed to sum up the totality of human knowledge. Despite Jesuit and government protests and cuts by timorous printers, Despite Jesuit and governmental protests and cuts by timorous printers, it appeared in 35 volumes between 1752 and the 1780s. Diderot was an enthusiast for science and saw the relationship between science and technology more clearly than most other philosophers. The most remarkable feature of the Encyclopédie were the plates that show machinery and industrial processes, but the entries and content of the encyclopedia reflected the interest and enthusiasm of Diderot and his fellow philosophers, and contained many of their most important writings. The work was an immense success and became the Bible of the faith in humanity's reason, pride in its accomplishments, and confident in its future. The main ideas of the Enlightenment took root all over Europe. 5 words, each of which bore the heavy freight of meaning in the 18th century, sum up these ruling ideas: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. The interests of the 1700s, the intellects of the 1700s believed as passionately in reason as the previous century, but with a difference. The reason of Voltaire relied more on experience and less on mathematics than that of Descartes in the previous century. Reason was a weapon of skeptical inquiry based on observed facts, or what Voltaire thought were facts, rather than a method of deduction from axioms. To the thinkers of the Enlightenment, reason was the alternative to superstition and prejudice. To the thinkers of the Enlightenment, reason was the alternative to superstition and prejudice. It was the only sure guide to principles that governed humanity and nature. They regarded reason as a pragmatic instrument applicable equally to agriculture, government, social relations, astronomy, and physics. One uses your mind to assemble the data to understand these disciplines and apply them in life as a whole. Nature was a second favorite word of the Enlightenment. Nature, or the natural, with the proper standards for measuring God and humanity. Everything was according to nature was reasonable, and therefore it was good. Voltaire and his contemporaries brought the idea of natural law to the peak of its prestige. One of them devised the following definition of natural law. He said it was the regular and consistent order of facts by which God rules the universe, the order which his wisdom presents to the senses and the reason of man, to serve them as an equal and common rule of conduct, and to guide them without distinction of race or sex toward perfection and happiness. Order and law then ruled throughout the universe. Reason permitted the discovery of that law. Humans might ignore or defy those laws, but they did so at their peril. To the enlightened, the road to happiness lay in conforming to nature and nature's laws. The enlightened elite of the 18th century looked on those who broke nature's laws in the same spirit as the clergy of the Middle Ages had regarded heretics who broke God's laws. They were rebels against the order of the universe. Break. Happiness in this world, not salvation and eternal rejoicing in the next, was the end that the philosophers had in view. Medieval Christianity, and its toleration of misery in this life and the expectation of compensation in the next, angered the philosophers. They demanded the realization of Christian ideals here and now. They have dominated They hated cruelty, judicial torture, slavery, and the callous treatment of the insane. An enlightened Italian civil servant of the Habsburgs, Cesare Beccaria, 1738 through 1794, was the first to suggest that savage penalties do not necessarily prevent crime, and to purpose a theory of penology. The next word was progress, and it was even more central to the constituent Enlightenment principles than happiness. The progress of civilization, they believed, was now out of God's hands and in those of humanity, thanks to the discovery of the use of nature's laws in government, economics, and technology. They could not have conceived of a progress that was purely secular and unrelated to God. They began to conceive of a progress that was purely secular and unrelated to God. Renaissance thinkers still felt themselves as inferior to the heroic Greeks and Romans. But even before a symbolic literary battle between the ancients and moderns that began in 1687, some thinkers had suggested that the moderns were as good and probably better than the ancients. In 1794, the Marquis de Condorcet, a mathematician and aristocratic reformer under sentence of death during the French Revolution, wrote a sketch for a historical wrote a sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind. This work summed up all of the opinion and optimism of his century. He saw that the strongest reasons for believing that nature had no set limits to the restoration of our hopes. He saw that the strongest reasons for believing that nature has set no limits to the realization of our hopes and forestall, quote, the abolition of inequality between the nations, the progress of equality within the nations, and the true perfection of humanity. Liberty, indeed, was yet another favorite word of the philosophers. Liberty, indeed, was yet another favorite word of the philosophers. They were acutely aware of the prevalence in France of arbitrary arrest and restrictions on speech, religion, trade, and employment. They envied Englishmen their economic, political, and religious liberties. Their concern for liberty was perhaps the most explosive tenet of their faith, but few considered that violence was necessary to secure it. Liberty for the philosophes was inseparable from reason, and reason would soon reveal the true natural laws governing all things, from trade to government to religion. The corruption of the present world became evident to all, a, quote, benevolent despotism, and a philosopher king would lead humanity into a new golden age. So Voltaire and many of the enlightened authors hoped, but what if despotism was by its very nature not benevolent? These new ideas inevitably had religious consequences. To the enlightened, religious fervor savored of the fanaticism of the wars of religion. The Enlightenment only prized enthusiasm for its new religion of reason, progress, and the perfection of humanity. The fashionable form of belief common among the 18th century's educated elite came to be called deism, the belief in a God who is a creator but not a redeemer. The God of the deist was a celestial watchmaker who had created the universe, wound it up, and then stepped aside to let it run according to natural law that he had laid down. God did not concern himself with humanity or act throughout human history. To a deist such as Voltaire, talk of revelation, of miracles, or the special intervention of God in the natural order was false. Dogma and ritual were superstition, for humanity needed only reason to see God and his works. Deism obviously tended to undermine Orthodox Christianity and to substitute for it a rationalist belief in God as first cause and in natural law as humanity's moral guide. Break. In the end, many Protestants found a compromise between Christian faith and the Enlightenment rationalism, humanitarianism, and tolerance. And the result was, in the 1800s, the development of a liberal Protestantism. Others took the road of a more intense piety. The old rationalism of deism held no appeal for emotional natures, and only the educated could understand it. Hence, the wide popularity of two warmly emotional Protestant movements, Pietism in Germany and Methodism in England and America. Both emphasized the importance of the inner religious experience or individual conversion. Pietism was a second and milder Protestant Reformation and challenged not only the Pope but the twin extremes of dogmatic orthodoxy and deism that verged on unbelief. The individualist, tolerant, and indifferent to extremes and ceremonies, Pietism attracted the followers among both Catholics and Protestants. John Wesley, 1703 to 1791, was a leader of a somewhat parallel revival of a warm and personal Christian piety in England in the years following his conversion in 1738. The Anglican clergy resisted his efforts. He took his message directly to the people. When the Anglican clergy resisted his methods and efforts, he took his message directly to the people. He addressed huge outdoor congregations and prayer meetings in remote chapels, taught his followers to sing their way to heaven with the hymns of his brother Charles, and deluged the congregations he had established with streams of pamphlets from his printing presses. In the end, Anglican opposition forced Wesley to leave the established church and to create a new denomination, Methodism, which took its name from the methodical piety of Wesley's followers that the Orthodox had originally mocked. Methodism touched many thousands of Englishmen at home and the colonies who found repellent the arid intellectualism that characterized much of 18th century Anglicanism. Methodism's wide following, its emphasis on other worldly concerns, and its conspicuous loyalty to temporal authority in this world made it more attractive and effective buttress of the social order than Anglicanism. The Enlightenment encouraged the beginning of the modern discipline of economics. The most prominent of the philosophers who delved into economics was Adam Smith of Edinburgh. The most prominent of the philosophers who delved into economics was Adam Smith of Edinburgh in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, 1776. The first classic of modern economics, period, break. In this, the first classic of modern economics, Smith expanded the concept of natural liberty to commerce and industry. He denounced all mercantilist practices, although he admitted that in an age of warring states, Smith expanded upon the concept of natural liberty to commerce and industry. He denounced all mercantilist practices, although he admitted that in an age of war, states might make measures such as navigation acts as necessary for a short time. In general, however, Smith maintained that the state intervention interfered with the workings of the natural law of supply and demand, and thus decreased rather than increased natural wealth. The invisible hand of natural law, Smith argued, was a self-regulating mechanism that automatically maximized the wealth and freedom of any society that respected it. To temper it was both dangerous and self-defeating. In political theory, the Enlightenment led three distinct in political liberty, the Enlightenment led to three distinct schools of thought. The first rested on the notion of, quote, enlightened absolutism, quote. The first rested on the notion of enlightened absolutism. The philosophers, children of their age, were no democrats. Voltaire thought that government should be for the people, but by kings. Voltaire thought that government should be for the people, but by kings. He said, the people are stupid and barbarous, and they need a yoke, a cattle prod, and pay. Most philosophers hoped for a mellowing of divine right monarchy into a benevolent, quote, enlightened form of government, with philosopher kings that would govern, perhaps, Most philosophers hoped for a mellowing of divine right monarchy into a benevolent, quote, enlightened philosopher kingship that would govern, perhaps with well-rewarded philosophers' advice, according to natural law rather than royal caprice. A second minority school believed that reason pointed in the direction of an English-style constitutional monarchy based on natural rights and on an explicit contract that bound the sovereign to respect his subjects' liberties. But a very few advanced a third theory still too radical to be of much immediate influence, and that was the theory of democratic government. That school's foremost prophet was the eccentric Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 through 1778, author of The Social Contract, who wrote in 1762. That school's most important prophet was the eccentric Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 through 1778, author of The Social Contract, which he released in 1762. Break. Rousseau, a native of Geneva, appeared in Paris in 1742 after a wandering youth. He came to know Diderot and other philosophes, and for a time attempted to join them. But it was never easy in their company. He trusted reason, but relied even more on emotion. He trusted nature, but to him nature was the unspoiled simplicity of pre-civilized humanity, the, quote, noble savage. By temperament, he was a shy and sensitive misfit who desperately wanted to belong. He knew himself to be good on the model of the noble savage. He therefore blamed his unhappiness, his failure to fit in, on the alleged artificiality of existing society, particularly Parisian society. That society of king aristocrats and priests, he felt, had openly corrupted and humiliated him. That society of kings, aristocrats, and priests, he felt, had openly corrupted and humiliated him. Consequently, he imagined an alternative, not a program for revolution, although many readers took it as one, but as a critique of existing societies. In The Social Contract, he described a utopia in which free citizens associated by choice in the community of equals to govern themselves. By agreeing to form a community, they gave up all individual rights to the group. From their deliberations, a general will would eventually emerge. This is very dangerous, as you would see in the French Revolution. Rousseau's belief in humanity's essential goodness precluded Rousseau's belief in humanity's essential goodness precluded conflict or dissent within its ideal community. Rousseau's belief in humanity's essential goodness precluded conflict or dissent within his ideal community. And once the general will emerged, all owed it absolute obedience. Rousseau's ideal democracy was direct democracy, the self-rule of a tightly knit community of active male citizens. For the most it's important to understand that most of the men of the Enlightenment It's important to understand that most of the men of the Enlightenment, Rousseau included, considered it part of the order of nature that woman obeys man. Perhaps Rousseau had in mind an idealized image of Geneva as he wrote The Social Contract. In that city-state, citizens knew and trusted one another, and the minority normally accepted the majority's view with good grace, out of loyalty to the community. Perhaps his hostility to kings and aristocrats Indeed, his temperamental aversion to all forms of authority absolved him of responsibility for the excesses committed in 1789 in the name break. Perhaps his hostility to kings and aristocrats, indeed his temperamental aversion to all forms of authority, absolved him of responsibility for the excesses committed in the name absolved him of responsibility for the excesses committed in 1789 and after 1789 in the name of the general will. But his theory of democracy was nevertheless a momentous illustration of the consequences, even the unintended consequences, of ideas. Locke and Montesquieu had argued that the guarantee of political liberty was the separation of executive and legislative powers, since the concentration of power threatened freedom. Their theory derived from an essential pessimism about human nature and their long experience of human ambition and the fallibility gained in the world of politics. Their theory of liberty was negative, that liberty arose when institutional and legal checks limited the powers of government. That negative theory of liberty, of individual rights against government, was the foundation of modern representative democracies such as Britain and that in the United States. For Rousseau, however, humanity was good, with the goodness of the noble savage, and that goodness would express itself naturally in politics once the artificial restraints and corrupting influence of the old society fell away. Checks and balances, quote, checks and balances, the separation of powers, the protection of specific rights such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press would serve no purpose if the people governed itself. Operating by the general will, by definition, society could not harm. Operating by the general will, by definition, society could not harm. Operating by the general will, by definition, society could not do harm to itself. In contrast to Locke and Montesquieu, Rousseau's theory of liberty was positive. His liberty was the willing obedience to laws and decisions that the individual himself had helped to make. His theory of liberty both set no limits at all on what government could do if it expressed or claimed to express, quote, the general will. In a justly famous passage in The Social Contract, Rousseau even asserted that the community actually could force individuals to be free. That hard phrase was the precursor of an even harder reality after 1789 in France, when the, quote, general will operated the regime of the guillotine. Rousseau died in 1778, but only by chronology bound him to the Enlightenment. His true home was the post-1789 world of revolution, nationalism, and romanticism that he helped shape. In conclusion, the Enlightenment was the creation of a small elite, although many of its essential ideas circulated widely and penetrated far down the social scale. It was largely confined to Western Europe and the English-speaking world. And countercurrents soon rose to challenge the supremacy of reason in philosophy and of rational structure and the classical balance in art. Pietism Methodism and Rousseau's preference for emotion over reason, or evidence of these currents, Pietism, Methodism, and Rousseau's preference for emotion over reason, or evidence of these currents. Even philosophers recognize reason had its limits. David Hume, who along with Adam Smith were the greatest figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, started from a close study of the great French skeptic Bayle. Hume ended by denying the possibility of certainty in any part of life. Only the experience of the senses, unverifiable by independent means, informed the mind about external reality. Hume's position, which has remained logically unassailable, cut at the heart of the Enlightenment faith in the capacity of reason to discover laws in nature and human behavior. Hume did not doubt the validity of Newton's laws as a rule of thumb. What he denied was that anyone could ever be in a position to claim with certainty that Newton's laws applied at all times, in all places throughout the universe. Even observations that seemed to confirm these laws might not do so, for the evidence of the senses might be a snare and a delusion. The sun might rise tomorrow, but then again, it might not. He was happy to concede, Hume was happy to concede that some types of knowledge were more certain than others, but he was the first philosopher to see the full depth of the predicament to which the collapse of the medieval religious certainties had plunged humanity. In the philosopher's studies, if not in practical affairs, certainty was unattainable. That was, in his words, the whimsical condition of mankind. Observer's point of view, the observer's point of view helps determine what the philosopher, the observer's point of view helps determine what the observer saw. Knowledge, like the human value system that varied through historical time and geographic space, was relative. Hume's skepticism did not shake an optimistic age that sought to replace God with Newton's clockwork universe. But a few far-sighted individuals nevertheless understood what he had done. The scientific revelation and the Enlightenment were the most decisive break in the history of Western thought. The world picture of 5th century Greece, the world picture of 5th century the world picture of 5th century Greece and that of the Old and New Testaments, preserved throughout the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, now gave way to a distinctively much more modern cast of mind. The world of Luther and that of Loyola, of Charles V and Philip II, was still organically related to the Middle Ages. The world of Newton and of Locke, of Voltaire and Rousseau, was unmistakably the world in which we live today. Our hopes and our dreams are cut off from any sense of certainty about life and liberty and freedom and science and economics. We're cast adrift in a world of uncertainty.